2018, the National Council of Public History had its conference annual conference in Hartford, Connecticut. And the keynote, the opening talk, was given by the mayor of the city. And he confessed that he didn't know what public history was. But because he was invited for a public history conference, what he did was to Google public history. And what he found on Google was the website of the NCPH, of the National Council on Public History. So he clicked on the website, and the first thing he reads in the definition was that public history is like pornography. You know it when you see it. And he said that he was very confused by that, comparing public history to pornography. You know it when you see it. And the audience was laughing, and it was a bit embarrassing for the discussion on what public history is. And I argue that no, public history is not like pornography. You don't know it when you see it. You need some definitions of public history. You have definitions of oral history, you have definitions of cultural history. Why not having a definition of public history? But having said that, it's very critical it's very easy to be critical towards a definition. This definition is not good enough. It's way more difficult to one definition of public history. And we can even wonder, do we need one definition of public history? It's a controversial subject. For example, in 2007, the National Council of Public History tried to give a new definition of public history. And they proposed, and I quote, public history is a movement, methodology, and approach that promotes the collaborative study and practice of history. Its practitioners embrace a mission to make their special insight accessible and useful to the public. And this, and in particular the term mission, created a huge controversy in the US, because a lot of historians, they don't have a mission to bring knowledge to the people, which is a very hierarchical way of thinking about your role. For many historians, they want to share, they want to work with, they don't have a mission. So that's only an example to tell you how difficult it is to create one definition for public history. So what do we do? Some people have used metaphors to define public history. And I want to give a few examples of metaphors that have been used. One very famous one is from Ludmila Jordanova in her book, History in Practice, where she compares public history as an umbrella, right? Public history is an umbrella. You have here an image about social science as an umbrella, so that gathers different fields. So public would be an umbrella that gathers different practices. Okay, fair enough. That's one metaphor to define public history. Other people have compared public history to a big tent. For example, Jennifer Dickey in 2018 compared public history as the big tent. And this expression of the big tent comes from actually the digital humanities from 2011, a conference when they compared digital humanities to a big tent. The process is the same. You have a tent that gathers different practices and fields. So public history would be a big tent. Okay. Someone that you all know, Marcello Raveduto, proposed something different. In the book edited by Paolo Farnetti, Lorenzo Bertuccelli, and Alfonso Botti, Marcello wrote a chapter called Il viaggio della storia dalla terraferma all'archipelago. And I believe, and Marcello tell me if I'm right, if I'm wrong, that in that metaphor, public history is an archipelago. It's made of different islands, right? Different practices. They're distinct, they're different, but they're connected to each other by the sea. So there's already something different here. Different practices, but connected by something, the sea. And I like that metaphor, and I would like to expand on that one. I think it's a very good way to conceive public history. So metaphors, and some people do not like metaphors. Some people think, like, for example, Marco Demantowski, who published Public History in School. In his introduction, Marco says that actually metaphors are just weak definitions. They are not really definitions, they are, metaphors, which is not exactly the same. So instead of a metaphor, Marco presents that scheme that you see on the left, saying that metaphors are not good enough, that we need a strong definition. I would tend to disagree with Marco for some reasons. I still think that metaphors are useful. Metaphors are useful because they are introduction, right? They may not be theoretical definition, but they are introductory steps. They can spark discussion. When you see a metaphor of the umbrella, of the archipelago, or the one I will use right after, you create discussion, right? That can lead to further theories. And the umbrella, the archipelago, they translate a definition of public history as a fragmented field. So it's fragmented, but it's united by something. It's united by a common understanding of history. So you do have a sort of understanding of history in the metaphors. I think we can go even further on what Marcello calls the C, the connection between the different practices. What unites the different practices in public history? So I was thinking about Marcello's metaphor, and I tried mine. I propose a new metaphor of public history that Marcello knows about that I would like to discuss. So I compare public history to a tree with the play word public is tree. That doesn't work in Italian or in French, but it does in English. So I want to give you just a few seconds to look at the tree, because I'm going to talk about different parts of the tree. So I give you a few seconds. Allows me to drink something. So the tree. What is in that tree? The tree is composed of 4 parts. The roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves. And I use that tree because it helps me to visualize what public history is. And it has some flaws, it has some disadvantages, some caveats, but I still like to use that metaphor of the tree. Why? So let's look at the tree. The roots at the bottom of the slide are the creation of sources, the creation or the preservation of sources. So you talk about archiving, you talk about museums collecting objects, you talk about preserving buildings, you talk about digital-born archives or history. So that's the creation of archives. The trunk, so the middle part, is perhaps the most traditional activity for historians. The trunk is interpreting the sources, so writing history from sources. After the trunk, or above the trunk, you have branches, and branches are the different ways you can communicate history. So you see, for example, video games on the right, you see blogs, you see books, obviously. You see TV, fiction, radio, reenactment, school. So you have multiple branches that are the multiple ways you can communicate history. And I like the tree because it helps me to show, especially students, that books and articles are by no way the only means you can communicate history, right? You can use blogs, you can use tour, so you have a multiple of ways to communicate history. Above the branches, you have the leaves, and the leaves are the different uses of history. So you have history used in education, top right, or you have history used for fun, for tourism, for marketing, for It seems that someone muted me in the meeting. So can you hear me now?
Sì,
okay.
va bene. Okay.
So you have different uses of history, and I like that tree. Also, it has some caveats. They have some problems. I don't, for example, I don't want to say that there is a creation from bottom to up. I don't want to say that it's a straight path. What I want to say, it's like an ecosystem. The tree is an ecosystem. All parts are connected. It means that public history, you need a trunk. You need historical understanding, analysis of sources. So you need that trunk in public history, but you also need the branches. So it's not enough to interpret sources. You need to communicate sources, right? It means that in public history, it's not only historians. In public history, you may have tour guides that will communicate the history made in the trunk. It means that you have archivists that are going to collect archives and create archives. So you have multiple actors in public history. It also means that historians can take part in the four aspects: in the trunk, obviously, but also in the communication, also in the creation of archives. It helps me to show that public history is a broader definition of making history. It's not only using and interpreting sources. Communication is part of public history. So from that metaphor, I think I touch upon the glue, or what Marcello calls the sea between the different practices, right? Because you have a process of doing history. I like to compare the tree to a process. We make public history with different steps. So this was the first part of my presentation. I would say the easy part. Because that's the part I know the most about, it coming from me, so I know about it. The second part is way more difficult for me because, let me move. The second part is about all the difficult, lots of difficult questions I received during the last 10 years about public history, the difficult questions I heard from panels, from conferences, from curators, from students. And you only have a few of them. Can give you a minute to look at the different difficult questions that I received. And I wanted in the second part of the talk to take some risk because I don't have the answers for all those questions, but I believe those are very important issues we need to talk about in public history. I think now we have worked at the international public history, we have conference events. I think it's time to work on the core issues of public history. As I say in the slide, to spice things up, to talk about a challenging aspect. And just to acknowledge that it's a work in progress, right? I acknowledge that it's not definite. It's only some answers about difficult questions. So stay with me in the sense that, I want to create discussion. I don't pretend to have all the answers at all. So the way I designed the second part of the talk is to start with criticism that were given to public history, or how I was criticized by colleagues, by partners, by people about public history. So I designed it by a list of questions or criticism that I want to try to answer. And I will start from the easiest to the toughest. The first one, the first question or criticism was not towards me, it was towards public history. It was a criticism by an Irish historian who said that a few years ago, there is no need for public history because we already have it, right? And his argument that you can see on the left-hand side was that all historians have a public, right? There is no such thing as a ivory tower. All historians have a public. He was also saying that lots of Irish historians write in newspapers, they're on radio, they're on TV, they write popular books. So he was saying, well, there's no need for public history. There's no need for a new field. We're already doing it. He was saying that people would, want to defend public history, just want to create a niche to get jobs, or they want to promote themselves. So my answer is that I would agree that all historians have a public. Even if two people read your article, it's a public, right? So the symbol of the ivory tower is misleading, right? It's not like public history is public and academic history is not public, right? The questions is more what publics do we have, right? So I would not oppose public history and not public history. I would say that there are different levels of public engagement. It's not the same if you have, again, 2 or 5 people reading your article, or if you have 1 million visitors in your exhibition. So I'm thinking in terms of levels of public engagement. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that not all historians are good at doing public history, right? It's the same as it's not because you're a good historian that you're a good teacher. I had plenty of good colleagues, good historians who cannot teach or are not done to teach, right? We all have those colleagues who are great researchers, but maybe they're not comfortable in the classroom. I think it's the same for public history. It's not because you're a good historian that you do good public history. You need to learn skills to do good public history, right? It's not because you're a good historian that you can communicate well, right? You need to learn oral speaking. You need to learn how to make a film. You need to learn how to make an exhibition. So you become a public history professional, right? So I would disagree with my colleague, my Irish colleague, saying that we don't need public history because we all do public history. No, we don't. So I would disagree. The second question or criticism about public history is that it's impossible to have one single or universal definition of public history. We cannot simply define public history. The argument is that there are so many different approaches of public history. There are so many different words, so many different profiles that it's impossible to have one definition of public history, or maybe there's no such thing as public history, right? And those people also say that to impose one definition would be an act of supremacy, right? Imposing one definition. I would tend to agree that it's impossible to have one single definition of public history. That's why the International Federation for Public History, the IFPH, does not have one definition of public history, because we don't want to impose one definition of public history. There are different approaches, different definitions of public history. There are different translations of public history. So I would agree that there is no one definition of public history. Going back to the translation issues, it's impossible to have one definition of public history because sometimes it's impossible to translate public and public history. You have a few examples here. I will go back to this later, but for example, the Brazilian at the right hand side of the slide, they translate in Historia Pública, which is the same in Spanish, Historia Pública. But on the left-hand side, in Poland, it's very difficult in Polish to define public history. So my colleague Joanna Woźden called history in the public sphere. And that's the master that they have in Wrocław, in Poland. It's history in the public sphere, which is for me slightly different than public history, but we go back to that. And I want you to know that the Italian Association doesn't translate public history into Historia Pubblica, and we're going to see why. So it's impossible to provide one definition, one single definition of public history. I would agree with that criticism. I think it's important that you find your own definition. And I want to mention the fantastic manifesto, the Italian manifesto for public history, with some specific approaches of public history. And I think it's important that national associations, groups, provide their own definition of public history, because now the Italian Association and the manifesto helps other people, helps us, the International Federation, to make a richer definition of public history. It's also good to remind, for example, North Americans that public history is not only the 20th century, that antiquity, Middle Ages can do public history, right? So this mixity of approaches is, I think, the true answer to the criticism of we don't have one single definition of public history. That is good, not to have one definition. All right, moving to a slightly more difficult criticism. A friend of mine, looking at the Facebook page of the International Federation or the Facebook page of the Italian Association, said to me, all right, public history is fine, but it looks like everything is becoming public history. And he said, do you agree? Is there a limit? Is everything public history? And I think it's a fair comment that we need to discuss. Because the argument is that since we don't have one single definition of public history and we have a broad understanding, or we have a tree, public history or metaphors, it leads to losing track of what's so special about public history. And I think that's a powerful criticism towards a public history. But again, I would not oppose public history and non-public history. Often I'm asked, okay, what's public history and what's not public history? I would go back to what I said, defining different levels of public perspective, right? It's not because you're an historian and you go on TV that you become, a public historian, right? I think you need a public perspective in your work. You have different levels of historical thinking, right? So it's not, is it public history or not public history, right? You need to take into consideration the levels of historical thinking. Do you have sources? Do you have interpretation? Do you have research? So I prefer to think in terms of levels of public history than opposing academic and public history. But the question becomes, what are the shared values of public history? And that's something I believe we need to work on. Something maybe useful for you, Serge, for tomorrow for the seminar on international public history. It's a criticism that a friend of mine told me about that book that you see on the left, that was published 2 years ago. And I'm writing in the book, so I'm part of the problem, I would say. The book is What is Public History Globally? And the first title was What's Global Public History? That changed into What is Public History Globally? But the question remains, are we talking about global public history? Are we talking about international public history? Are we talking about transnational public history? What are we talking about? And again, I think it's a difficult question. The argument is that there is no such thing as a global public history. And I agree. There is no global public history. But what there is a global questioning. There's a global demand for an answer. What is history today? What is the role of an historian? There is a global discussion about that, right? And public history is only one of the answers, but there is a global questioning. I also think that public history calls for democratic and public participation, right? And that calls for a broadening of public history. But that doesn't solve the question of, is it transnational or international? The federation, the International Federation, is called International Federation, right? So are we talking about relations between nations, right? What are we talking about? This is to give you an example. about this transnational versus international. And I would encourage to read Serge Noiret's chapter that I co-wrote about international public history in the global perspective. This is a map that the International Federation for Public History has collaborated to make. It's about the different projects that document the COVID-19 memories, right? So you have a map of projects all around the world. So what we discover is that there are very, very few projects that go beyond the national, right? Only one of the very few examples out of 600 projects, I think you have like a dozen of projects that go beyond the national frame. One example is the Journal of the Plague Year, which is based in the US, but that connects with partners all around the world in a transnational way, because they're questioning COVID memories regardless of the nation. But most of the projects in public history remain at the local or national level. There are very few transnational public history. Another question that I received in Japan last year, something that I was surprised, I should admit, to be questioned about that. I was criticized for contributing to a Western imperialism, saying that public history is a model born in the United States that spread to Europe, which is very Western oriented. So I was criticized for bringing a Western model to Japanese historians who would disagree with my conception of the public. And I think that's an important question that made me think about my understanding of public, my understanding of history. This is true that for sometimes some people, especially coming from the US, presented themselves as missionaries. We're bringing you one model. And I think that even Wesley Johnson was one of the fathers of public history in the US, sometimes adopted that view when he came to Europe in the 1980s, like bringing a model. So I think that there is something here. There's also the language. English, if you do a conference in public history, international conference, it's in English, right? And languages are important. There is a sort of English imperialism in the resources, in the books. So if you want to study, most of the resources are in English. So there is something. I would agree with, tend to agree with my Japanese colleague who said that there's a sort of imperialism from the West. But I think there's more than that, because if you look at, excuse me, the map of, it's a map that we have created about programs of public history around the world. So courses, teams, lab, research centers. Well, obviously there are some in Europe, there are some in the US, in Canada, but you see many in Latin America. You see many in Australia, you see some in Asia. So there's definitely a Western trope, but it's not a European thing, right? And if you look at the national associations of public history, yes, you have some in the US, you have one in Italy, one in Spain, but you also have one in Brazil and in Japan, right? So the public history in that case is broad and is developed by Japanese colleagues. So I'm not bringing them public history. They develop their own understanding of public history. So I would say that the criticism of public history being Western oriented is a bit simplistic, although it makes us think about what definition do we have of public? Because as we will see, you cannot translate public into Japanese easily. Going even further into the criticism of public history, I think, right, I'm checking the time, I'm doing all right. There is an argument that public history is only communication. I received, I should say, a very strong criticism from German colleagues during a conference in Serbia. Their argument was that we are not working at the university in the history department to teach podcasts. They're not there to teach communication. They're not there to teach GIS and mapping. They are here to teach history. And in their mind, history, useful history, is the image that you see at the left. And I'm not joking. They say that for them, true history cannot be less than 600 pages because you need all the details. You need a full picture. And I'm sorry, I have a very definition of what history is, because if you go back to the tree, that's the trunk. Yes, we need a trunk with a solid research, but public history goes beyond that. It's not only this. Critical methodology is important, but it's not enough. And I would even say that when they criticize communication, when you write a PhD thesis, you're right. It's a form of communication. If you submit a PhD thesis with mistakes, misspelling, with heavy style and full of disorganized paragraphs, that would not look good, right? Communication is important, and we need to learn communication to work in the public space and with the public. So communication is important, but public history is not only communication. Slightly different. Even more difficult, a question that comes back every now and then, sometimes a criticism saying that public history is simply collective memory. And I think we need to discuss the relations between history, memory, public history. The argument, and I'm quoting one argument in particular, came from a conference in Ecuador about public history and museums. And there was this Ecuadorian colleague, historian, very nice, who made the keynote and compared public history to memory studies. He was very inspired by Nora, by Rousseau, the French leaders of the memory studies, among others. And he was saying that basically public history is studying group memories. And I think that's an argument that we need to discuss, because every time we organize conferences on public history, a good number of the presentations are about memories, right? A lot of time it's about historians studying memories, group memories, through different medium, but still studying memories. And my personal view, and that's my view, is that public history and memory studies are different. We're not, reinventing the thing with a different word, but the same practice. Public history is not memory studies. For me, public history is a process with a public perspective. It's a production. It's not studying memories. At least it could be like working with memories, right? It's different. Also because if you're an historian and you study memory, you tend to oppose history and memory. And I believe that public history is doing something different. And I think we need to discuss that. Public history, I wouldn't say reconcile history and memory, but has a very specific relation with memory. To give you one example, this is an exhibition organized in Minnesota, in the US, in the United States, about the commemoration of the creation of the state of Minnesota. And the museum asked people to submit ideas of people, places, and things that you can see on the right that shape the state. So the museum was asking people to send ideas, to send objects, to send memories. And those memories became part of the exhibition that we can call a public history project. In the exhibition, you had the object, you had the memories from that person saying that memories was important for this and that. And you had this into a broader historical understanding. So let's to make it clear, to make it simple, the voice of the curator, the historian context. So you had the, memories and the voice of the curator, the expertise together, creating something different. It's not memories and history, it's something together. And I think that public history is not studying memories. Public history can give a voice to memory and can give a spot of memory to create something bigger and broader than simply history or memory. A question that came up 2 years ago about public history, saying that there's no such thing as the public. This is not a new idea. Curators, museum staff have been talking about that. There's no one public. But what about public history? It was a conference organized in Poland in 2019 called The Public in Public and Applied History. It was I wasn't there, but the summaries were very interesting. There was a discussion about not calling public history, but the funny proposal from my colleague in the International Federation, David Dean, who said, why not calling it public's history? Because there is no such thing as the public. There are publics. He was joking, but I think there is a discussion to have here. I agree that the public does not exist. It's not one thing. It's not one entity. You have publics. You have different audiences. You have different understandings of the past. And this variety of publics impact your research, right? Because if you work in a museum and if you want to talk to the publics, plural, you may have different interpretations in your exhibition. On the left, you see a family visiting a museum, and obviously you can have someone standing for the kids, the children, understanding the past, for grown-up, for historians, for tourists, for actors. So you may have different interpretations in one single, project. So yes, publics in public history, and we should be aware of the impact of this variety of public. Something that I touched upon at the beginning, lost in translation. One issue in international public history is how do you translate public history? For the article that I published in 2018 on the rise of international public history in Spanish, we had a huge discussion with the translator about how should I translate public history in Spanish? And the question is the same in French. Do you translate into histoire publique? Or during the conference in Japan, in Tokyo, the translator asked me, I cannot translate public history because public cannot be easily translated to Japanese. Right? And this is important. This is not a detail because sometimes it's impossible to translate public from public history. You have various examples here on the right in France, and that's something still debated. The trend seems to be to translate into histoire publique. The master in Paris, which is the only master of public history, is called histoire publique. In Spanish, the new association that was created last month translates into historia publica. As I said at the beginning, in Poland, they do not. Why? Because, and it's also the discussion about France and to some extent Italy. When you say public in French, it has a connotation. It's connected to the welfare state, and some people think, oh, histoire publique, that's the history of administration, of the civil servants. No, it's not. Or you have the expression in French, femme publique, which is, another name for fille facile, something pejorative, something you don't want to use. So it's very difficult to translate into French. The way that the Italian association did was to use the English name, the Associazione Italiana di Public History. And I think it's important, and I think that's a smart move, because it forces Italians, members, to think about what public history is in the Italian sphere framework. And that forces us to think about not only translating, but having our own approach of public history. Well, let's make it even more difficult. I think the most difficult issues I've been dealing with is about authority. Because one aspect of public history is the collaboration, working with people. But if you work with people, you question the definition of authority and expertise. And I think that's the toughest discussion we can have today on public history. And one criticism about public history has been about the concept of shared authority. Developed by Michael Frisch, saying that the criticism would say that if you share authority, you deny historians their expertise. So it's a strong criticism towards public history that I want to spend some time upon. So as I said, Michael Frisch published his book in 1990, and he developed the concept of shared authority. And there have been multiple misunderstandings of the expression, because it's been criticized for historians losing their authority, saying that, well, if you share authority, why do we have historians? Or even people saying that, share authority means that public history leads to relativism. Everything is equal, right? That's not my understanding of share authority. I believe that share authority encourages us, forces us to open the definition of authority. Right? It doesn't mean that you historians do not have authority. It means that in doing public history, other people have some expertise too. Right? If you go back to the public history, you remember you have the trunk, the historian, he's doing research, but you also have archives, you also have communication branches. And those people have expertise too. If you take the example of an exhibition, you're an historian working in an exhibition, you're not the only one. You're going to collaborate with a curator. You're going to collaborate with a designer. You're going to collaborate with a marketing officer. You're going to collaborate with an education officer. They have expertise too, right? You don't do an exhibition by yourself. So you share authority with them. And if you don't, well, you may end up in a very poor and bad exhibition. So we do share authority anyway. That is the tree I was referring to. You have multiple actors with whom you share authority. Right? It doesn't mean that historians it doesn't mean that they lose their authority. It means that you have multiple expertises, right? So you have expert designer, curators, video producers. If you, an historian, want to make a documentary film, you're going to work with someone with video editing skills, an expert, right? I think the problem comes when you ask historians to share authority with the public and publics. And again, there are different levels. In public history, historians can share authority with people who know history, local historians, amateur historians, even if they don't have a position in university. So those people know things too. So we can share some authority with them. You can also share authority with people who have a living expertise, right? Those can be people who went through the event that you're studying. So a witness, for example, that you interview, you kind of share authority with him or her, or people who have living traditions. And here I want to give the example of the indigenous populations who become curator. Native population in Canada, in the US, where I know more examples, participate in exhibitions, for example, as you can see on the slide. They have some expertise too. They can bring their understanding of the objects, right? So, and they're part of the publics. So there are ways you can share expertise. Historians, curators, publics. It doesn't mean that everybody has expertise, but it means that we have to broaden the definition of expertise. I'm not saying, top right, I'm not saying that all expertise are on the same level. I'm not saying that everything is equal, but I'm saying that historians have and should share authority with a curator and people who know about the topic, right? I'm not saying that all interpretations are equal. Some are not true, or some are less informed than others, right? Shared authority doesn't mean equal interpretations of the past. The whole point of public history is to provide tools for collaboration, to construct history together. And I would even say that public history, the role of public historian and people who do public history is not to share a product, but to share the process, the tools, how to study a source, how to use a source. So as you can see, share authority is one, and it's by no means a final and definite answer. It's just my answer to this question. Another question, difficult question, is who owns the past? I've had this question a couple of times. People asking me, since you share authority, then who owns the past? Who can decide what's the true interpretation of the past? Who have authority to define the past? And again, that's a difficult question. I don't know who owns the past. Who am I to decide who owns the past? And I even think that it's a difficult question. It's a dangerous path. To talk about that, there's this famous example, the Enola Gay exhibition in 1995, the project at the Smithsonian Museum in the US. The exhibition was supposed to talk about the atomic bomb in 1945 in Japan. You have a quote from one curator saying, and I can read it, top left, how do we remember a war that we won? Do you want to do an exhibit to make veterans feel good? Or do you want an exhibition that will lead our visitors about the consequences of being? I don't think we can both. It's important because due to the pressure of veteran groups who say that it's not possible to question the bomb because it's not patriotic, because of that pressure, the museum the director had to resign and the exhibition was cancelled. So the question that who owns the past? Do veterans own the past? Do historians own the past? Do museums own the past? I think that's ownership of the past is a dangerous question. That's not how we should conceive history and the past. Because if we talk about ownership of the past, then you can justify memory loss and state control or censorship. Here are just a few examples of memory laws that have been passed in France in 2005 about colonization. In China, in 2015, there's a law that prevents people, including historians, to challenge leaders like Mao Zedong. Or the law in Poland in 2018 that tried to criminalize the historical interpretation of Polish helping the Nazi, right? So the state saying we own the past. This is how you should interpret the past. So owning the past is not, I think, the proper way we should talk about authority in the past. Because public history is based on core values. And that's something that's been in the news recently about political pressure. I think there's a need for public history to support freedom of research, freedom of interpretation, and the possibility to be critical with the past, right? Because if you lose that right to be critical with the past, then there is no point of having history at all. So who owns the past? I would say no one. I think the most important aspect is to keep that right to be critical about interpretations of the past. A question, have a few left. A question, difficult question that I got about objectivity, saying that public history is compromising objectivity because it includes multiple partners that have different objectives. right? So if you collaborate with people who do not care about is it true or not, you're, compromising history. It's a very powerful criticism. The argument is that history is based on objectivity, but because public history is a collaboration with different partners who do not have objectivity as a then public history is doomed to fail. And it reminds me of the joke about my cat has 4 legs, my dog has 4 legs, so my dog is a cat. I think the principle is wrong. The principle is wrong to oppose one objective history versus multiple memories, right? Having said that, that's true. Then when you collaborate with some groups and some people, you face some ethical issues. When you work as an historian with a community that want to celebrate the past and do not want to talk about the difficult aspect, you have ethical issues, right? I think it depends the role of the historian in the project. There is no one single solution. I think there are some issues we need to talk about. If you work, for example, as a consultant for a private company, and I can use my own example. Last year, I was working with a beer company, a brewery. I was helping them to create their archives. I was also helping them to create their brewery history. And we had to go through some, not difficult, but some discussion, a memorandum of agreement and a contract, because I didn't want to simply celebrate their history. I wanted to bring some context. I wanted to bring understanding of the past. And sometimes it can be difficult when the company doesn't want to talk about specific things. So we, in my training, I proposed for students to learn about contract, agreements, and memorandum, because we need to set up the rules of the collaboration with partners and clients. Historians working with producers. This is an example of Zeman Davis, famous for historical consulting for the movie Retour de Martin Guerre. The problem is that when historians are advisor for films or documentary films, they may have very different objectives. The producers may want to make money or to have to increase the number of views. Historians may not have the same objectives, right? And producers may want visually appealing sources, testimonies. So historians have to adapt to a specific type of source. So you have different objectives for the historians and the producers. But Zeman Davis had this very clever answer about, is history biased in documentary film or fiction? For her, she said that what mattered for her the most was to provide a general historical understanding of the past to the audience. Even if some details were not true, but if the historians can succeed in bringing some historical understanding of the situation in the 16th century, then you win. I think there are I wouldn't call it compromises, but collaboration to discuss between historians, producers, clients, and so on. And finally, I do think that historians need to learn the skill to make history and public history themselves. If you fed up with movies, documentary films that are inaccurate, make your own film, make your own documentary. This is an example of a documentary I made 3 years ago about the history of French in Louisiana. I had to learn how to make a documentary film. But if you do that, historians are not only consultants, they can become producers. And to do that, you need video editing skills, you need interviewing skills, but I think that can solve partly some of those issues. I'm gonna move away from that because there are, Marcello, can I have like 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because I have 2 tough questions I would like to try to answer. So, what about conflicting interpretations? If historians collaborate with partners, or if you make history public, you're going to have conflicting interpretation of the past. People would disagree about the past. And that's a fair criticism towards public history. So how do we deal with conflicting interpretations? Or, as my Korean friend asked me, does public history have a way to deal with reconciliation? Right? So how do you deal with conflicting views of the past? I don't have a single solution. I don't have a magical solution. I think that the opposition between true or not true is important, but it's not enough. I think what matters the most for public history is to have a framework of construction. And I want to show you some examples of what I mean by that. How do you deal with people who say that in the US that slavery was not that bad, for example? I've had those kind of people. So the question is, how do you deal with what we could call a myth, right? I think public history can help bringing a framework that contextualize the past. I think that's key for history, for historians. We should not lose that, right? But we also need to ask people, how do you know what you know? Because history is different from opinion. How do you know what you know? As an example, there was this person who said that, oh, in my family, we had slaves, and slaves were happy. So how do you deal with that statement? And the picture is about the myth of happy slaves. And slavery was not about happiness. But how do you deal with that people? So you can confront that person and say, that's not true, right? And you disagree and then nothing happens. Or you can, that's one way of dealing with that. You can also work with that person. How do you know that? I mean, family stories. What are the evidence? What does that mean? Or if you have one evidence, can we contextualize the source? It's not because you find somewhere once that, oh, my slave was happy, that you should not be critical with that, right? So I think it's very important to have a framework in which we bring people into making history, thinking about why they know what they know, right? And we may not convince them that, slavery was not about happy slave, but I think having this framework of interpretation can help. I think an example is about Northern Ireland. How do you deal with people who have different understanding of one single event? For example, the Battle of the Boyne, 1690. For many Protestants, that was the victory of William, the victory of democracy. For many Catholics, no, it was a step in the religious discrimination against Catholics. So they have different and opposite interpretation. One way that was used in a public history project was to bring that event into a broader context. Again, contextualization. And in 1690, the battle was not that much about, those Irish Protestant or Catholics. It was a battle between Louis XIV and the Grand Alliance. It was a European diplomacy battle. The past was more complex than a binary opposition between Protestant and Catholics. You had multiple meanings, and the past was complex. If you create that framework in which the complexity of the past is deconstructed, I think you can get somewhere. And one final example is about some new media that adopt a non-linear understanding of the past, right? Some transmedia, especially digital media, use storytelling or web documentary to provide multiple understanding of the past, right? Evidence, testimonies, different point of views, but also a historical context. This is one example from Gaza and the very controversial understanding of what's happening in Gaza. And I believe that new media, web documentary in particular, when you can have multiple sessions, multiple interpretations, can be very useful. And I will finish, that's going to be my last slide because I want to keep time for the discussion. For historians, it means that you can have different interpretations of the past. One easy example is that the First World War, you may have a different interpretation if you look at the national narratives or the everyday life in town or through the eyes of ethnic minorities. It doesn't change what happened. but the interpretation may be different depending on the level and scope that you're studying. Sarah Lloyd and Julia Moore called that the sedimented histories. It means that different histories can be together, can be connected, and not uniform, right? She said that it provides ways to have different interpretations and make people think about their connection, how they differ, and how they work together. I think this is a key aspect of public history. I wanna, well, I had other discussions like, is public history leftist? Is public history more on the left than on the right? But I don't really have time to discuss that today. How do you deal with supremacists and monuments? Can you share authority with white supremacists and people you disagree with? I think it's an important question, and we can discuss that in the questions. And finally, is public history neoliberal? That's an argument that I had as well. Universities trying to develop public history because they're neoliberal. So a few, as you can see, the field is growing as the questions are, and I think we need to discuss more about those issues, about the role of historians and the impact of working with people. So I'm gonna stop my sharing my screen, and we'll hopefully have questions and comments. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie a Tomà. E io direi che adesso noi possiamo aprire la fase delle domande da parte appunto dei presenti. Utilizziamo, se possibile, l'alzata di mano, the hand, stand up your hand, e soprattutto vi chiederei di raccogliere le domande in inglese e in italiano in maniera indifferente, in modo che poi il professore Covan possa fare una replica finale a tutte le domande, in modo da dare un quadro generale a tutto, diciamo, a tutta la discussione. Quindi start questions. Già ce n'è una, penso una prima, vediamo, di Enrica Salvatori. Prego.
Come facciamo a raccogliere Marcello, visto che non c'è attiva la chat?
Non ho capito?
Non posso...
Con la mano e parlate. Con la mano e parlate.
Ok, then I speak. Hi, Thomas. I have to say that I used your tree, public history tree, in my lesson this year. I found it very useful. And but actually I used it, I teach digital public history, as you know, but I used it to describe the work of the historian itself. Okay, not the public historian, not the digital public historian. And normally I say to my students that maybe the traditional historian, the tree is more like a cypress, and for the digital public historian, is more like I don't know, the name is willow cypress. So cypress sol en France, le tree qui avec les oh, do you know what I mean? Okay, the tree that is with the branch that touch the ground. Okay, so everything is connected. It's really difficult to define what is roots, what is trunk, what is branches. Maybe okay, we need I agree with you, we need some sort of metaphor. We need to understand better our job, and maybe this large amount of branches and non mi ricordo come si dice foglia, ma mi verrà, leaves is good to understand that our projection toward the public, the fact that we are projected toward the public, the publics, but actually is just the same. I don't see now the real difference only in the shape of this tree. So this is my observation, and I agree with all the other things you have said. Okay.
Grazie Enrica, e passiamo la parola ad Hernán Rodríguez.
Sì, buonasera. Farò la mia domanda in italiano. In realtà sono due. La prima riguarda quel senso, diciamo, globale della storia pubblica. Se c'è pure il rischio di, ad esempio, nazionalizzarla, cioè non solo di inserirla all'interno dei discorsi sulla memoria, ma anche di, diciamo, rinchiuderla in questione della storia o delle storie nazionali, secondo i posti in cui si fa, se la Spagna, se la Francia, se il Brasile, eccetera. E poi in un secondo momento il rapporto per la decisione di scegliere le metafore. Se in questo contesto c'è anche qualche rapporto o qualche approfondimento partendo ad esempio dalla filosofia del linguaggio o dagli studi linguistici sull'utilizzo delle metafore. È questo. E grazie mille della presentazione, è davvero molto interessante.
Ok, Hernán, grazie. La parola a Serge Noiret.
Ecco, scusate. Prima di tutto grazie davvero Thomas, perché questo fresco che sei riuscito a tranciare in 1 ora e 20 è una cosa assolutamente complessa e completa, che poi ci pone tante domande. Io le voglio fare in italiano, ovviamente, perché tu capisci l'italiano, ci mi puoi rispondere in inglese. A proposito di 4 parole, cioè che poi tu hai approfonditi e che, sulle quali secondo me ci vuole anche un altro po' di riflessione, vedendo le tante interpretazioni che ci sono attorno a questi termini. Primo, internazionale. Allora, internazionale, esiste una public history internazionale, abbiamo scritto nel nostro saggio dell'Oxford Handbook che lo è quando è locale, nel senso che è sempre locale o sotto il livello della nazione, ma che ha delle metodologie, delle questioni, delle domande, dei modi per arrivare a produrre processi pratiche che sono simili in paesi come l'Australia, l'Italia, il Canada o il Sudafrica. Dunque, secondo me questo è qualcosa che possiamo eventualmente considerare come acquisito a livello internazionale. Poi la seconda parola, secondo me, è memoria. Memoria, anche sempre in questo saggio che abbiamo fatto, abbiamo detto che la memoria è un oggetto che viene utilizzato, studiato e messo in ordine dalla storia, ma anche dai public historian. Cioè i public historian hanno le memorie individuali e collettive, ci fanno ovviamente buon uso all'interno dei progetti che realizzano e come vanno a... e dunque non c'è un vero conflitto tra memoria e storia nella public history. Mentre c'è molto di più, secondo me, nella storia tradizionale. Cioè noi abbiamo, attraverso i nostri processi di autorità condivisa, oppure anche di utenti, cioè contenuti generati dagli utenti che sono memoriali, che sono familiari, che sono testimonianze, che permettono ovviamente di costituire un approccio a una comunità, sono inerenti alle pratiche della public history. Dunque io non vedo questo gran conflitto, grande problema della memoria che viene evacuata come qualcosa di altro dagli storici quando si tratta di public history. E poi c'è il termine che hai molto usato, e forse lì è l'unica cosa con la quale potrei dissentire un po', perché io condivido assolutamente tutto quello che hai detto. E ti devo dire che molte delle domande che hai avuto sono le domande che abbiamo continuamente, ma è molto bello come l'hai fatto per farci capire quali sono ovviamente gli interrogativi che giustamente le persone, gli storici oppure altre persone, altri professionisti hanno quando si parla di public history. E la parola past, il passato. Allora, su questo io penso che non esiste il passato, esiste soltanto la visione che noi abbiamo attraverso una ricostituzione storica o una memoria di quello che è la nostra interpretazione del passato. Forse è quello che hai detto poi dopo, ma lo utilizzano molto gli americani il termine di past, come se fosse qualcosa di tangibile, di spiegabile, di costituito e di presente, ma secondo me non esiste. Ecco, su questo vorrei avere. E poi l'ultimo punto è quello che giustamente hai detto a proposito di la storia, la public history è solo comunicazione. Io andrei più lontano ancora, perché in Italia molti pensano, per esempio, e questo se dovesse mettere su una domanda critica che ci viene soprattutto in Italia, è che la public history è la comunicazione della conoscenza accademica e dunque che serve soltanto a far conoscere ad altri pubblici fuori dall'università quelle che sono le scoperte scientifiche degli storici. Ecco, questo per me è una domanda che ovviamente tu ci hai risposto attraverso tutto quello che hai detto, ma è lì al centro, sul tavolo di quello che sono le nostre preoccupazioni, perché poi in molti libri, anche scritti da persone importanti o da giornalisti, ritorna sempre quest'idea. Grazie ancora, Antonio.
Grazie Serge, la parola a Chiara Ottaviano.
Ciao Tomà, è stato veramente bello sentirti, una bellissima lezione che condivido in grandissimissima parte. Per questo, giusto per vediamo se poi è vero, ecco. Allora, mi sembra di capire che anche per te essere public historian, prima di tutto bisogna essere degli storici, perché altrimenti non puoi avere quell'autorità che ti pone in modo diverso rispetto agli altri con cui collabori, con cui partecipi, con cui costruisci anche delle ricerche, no? Delle cose. Quindi bisogna avere quel tipo di competenza che è degli storici, che è quello di che cosa? Anche avere a che fare con le fonti, che le fonti siano la memoria, il documento scritto, le fonti orali, la lettera conservata in famiglia, le metodologie, no, che abbiamo imparato devono essere messe in campo. No, dico questo perché ogni tanto c'è un po' di confusione su questa possibilità di fare il salto, no? Cioè siamo bravi a comunicare, a coinvolgere, però poi magari non abbiamo veramente le basi di metodologia della ricerca storica su via. È una discussione che si fa intensamente. Ecco. Poi per il resto mi sembra di essere veramente d'accordo con te anche in questo, cioè in realtà e ovviamente sono d'accordo con chi ha parlato prima di me, con Serge in particolare su quest'ultimo aspetto rispetto alla comunicazione, perché se è vero che devono sapere comunicare, è anche vero che noi dovremmo avere come public research qualche capacità in più anche di fare ricerca in modo innovativo, coinvolgendo quel tipo di partecipazione, appunto di fare, diciamo, la storia in pubblico e con il pubblico, quindi con una capacità di coinvolgere, e lì è un banco di prova complicato, e lì c'è un'autorità condivisa nel senso non nel senso di partecipazione, cioè quella ricerca è fatta da persone che, come hai detto tu, che portano anche saperi diversi e competenze diverse nella costruzione del prodotto finale, no? Che è un prodotto di storia. Grazie.
Grazie Chiara. Visto che non c'è al momento nessun altro in coda, vorrei io aggiungermi con una piccolissima riflessione, sperando appunto di consentire poi a Tomà di rispondere a tutti e velocemente. Perché sì, io condivido ciò che ha detto Serge alla fine sul passato, però è anche vero che forse uno dei nostri ruoli dentro le dinamiche globali di come il passato si sta come narrazione impossessando del senso comune della storia. Io credo appunto quando gli americani parlano di missione, no? Come tu ci hai ben ricordato, quando questo penso sia anche molto legato al loro modo di affrontare le tematiche pubbliche legate alla religiosità civile americana, no? Al fatto di sentirsi sempre pronti gli americani ad impegnarsi nel pubblico e per il pubblico per la questione della nazione, dell'America, no? E credo che questo aspetto della missione possa essere ritradotto, diciamo, fuori dall'America in un impegno civile degli storici, un impegno nella società, in un ruolo sociale degli storici, e questo può determinare anche un nuovo approccio a questa dimensione di comunicazione e passato, perché secondo me comunicazione della storia e passato sono due termini che vanno coniugati insieme, perché molto del passato, del racconto della storia che noi chiamiamo passato, è in sostanza una comunicazione della storia che incorpora, che mette dentro anche tutto un discorso sull'immaginario della storia, sulle rappresentazioni della storia. E queste rappresentazioni della storia, in una dimensione in cui la comunicazione della storia diventa non più sharing authority, ma shared authority, cioè autorità già condivisa perché condivisibile nel digitale e nei social network, ci pone di fronte alla necessità di vedere e di intervenire, diciamo, come
I can't hear you, Marcello.
Eccomi, scusatemi, ma diciamo, velocemente chiudo, a comprendere ciò che c'è dietro la comunicazione della storia. Spesso la comunicazione della storia non è neanche più uso pubblico, diventa un elemento di dibattito del pubblico e nel pubblico, dal quale gli storici sono completamente esclusi. E si costruisce quindi un immaginario della storia, una rappresentazione della storia che colonizza il senso pubblico e spesso questo senso pubblico tratta la storia e gli storici, anche quando sono public historian, come degli intrusi, come quelli che vogliono riportare l'autorità della storia in un mondo che si è liberato, diciamo, della casta, diciamo così, ma questo è un termine italiano, cioè diciamo, degli scienziati che vogliono imporre necessariamente la loro visione. Non so se sono stato chiaro, perché facendo la domanda in italiano potrebbe essere stato un po' complicato, però a te le risposte a tutti quanti noi. Grazie.
Thank you, Marcello. Thank you, Chiara, Hernan, Serge, Enrica. Gonna try to answer them all. Enrica, the tree, I agree with you that having the leaves le foglie, is important because there is always, I think, in doing public history, a public perspective, and knowing that your history, if you're a historian, you know, that your history will be used by someone in different publics, different uses, also is important to in your process. So the leaves are not simply the end of the process. They are connected to the branches, the trunk, and the roots. So I agree with you. And then the risk of national public history, that's true. I see your point. I think the reason why we have Spanish, Italian, Brazil, Japanese is simply to organize networks. I think it's important what the Italian Association has done to gather people. I think this is a very logistic approach, but this is useful because it creates a space of discussion. I agree we should not, have only national groups, and the role of the International Association is to mix, Italians with Portuguese, with Japanese, for discussions, and we discuss about one topic and not one nation. I see your point, and I think we're trying to be aware of that. Thank you, Anand, for the mention of the linguistic and the language aspect of the metaphor. There is so much about the concept of the metaphor and what it implies that I should read about. So far, I only use the metaphor as a teaching tool, but I agree with you. There is a methodology, there is a concept, there's a philosophy behind it. Especially the tree, because it connects to, for example, genealogy, and then it can become problematic because you have the roots and identity issues. So I agree, I need to develop more the theory of the metaphor. Serge, where to start? International and local, yes. I would say that local is a beautiful concept. It's not always used in public history projects. I agree it's important to connect local and other levels of interpretation. For example, using family history, family objects, and bringing a broader context is a form of local work. I agree it's important. It's not always used, but that's something we should support, yes. Memory. Your question about memory and saying that in public history, if I understand correctly, in public history there is no straight opposition between history and memory. Yes, I agree, that's my point. But many colleagues who do not do public history have this very different view of saying memory and history are different. We study memory, history is objective. So it's also a talk for them to show that having memory and history together is not impossible. But yeah, I agree with you. We have the same point. The past. Thank you. The past. The reason maybe we mentioned the past more in the US. The reason why I do it is I want people to understand that history is not the past, right? That it's not because they see something about the past that it's true. And very often publics confuse history and the past. They say, well, this is written, this is the past. I would say no, I think we reach the past through history. If you said that the past does not exist, I'm afraid that's going to be a post-structuralist approach, and I'm going to lose my audience. If I said that the past doesn't exist, we only have interpretation, I would say that we cannot reach the past, right? We can only interpret the past. But if I delete the past, I'm going to lose my audience. So I prefer to say that the past, history, and there's a process, a construction to try to interpret the past. But I don't think we disagree. I think we have.
No, the idea is that the memory that the people have is their conception of the past. So you have memories and.
Yeah. No, I agree I agree totally with you, and that goes back to the question of we only reach the path through memory, through sources, and there's a production together to discuss the past. So I think we agree on that. Communication, that's a big topic. Obviously, I don't think that public history is only communication. I think for me, public participation is very important, and it goes beyond communication. And I think if I go back to the tree, there is no communication without archives. There is no communication without historical research. In other words, there is no branches without the trunk. So I would never disconnect communication from the trunk or from the roots. I think the beauty of public history is that it connects communication, so YouTube channel, for example, with research, interpretation, archives. The more we connect the roots, the trunk, and the branches, I think the stronger public history is. But I see your point about people saying that public history is merely and only communication. It's not. And we should try to say that public history, and it goes back to what Chiara was saying, is also with methodology, sources, interpretation. We should share that process instead of simply communicating it. I'm trying to see what I wrote. Yes, and communication is also important because it impacts the research, right? Because if you choose a medium, for example, an exhibition, it may impact how you're going to do research, what types of source you're going to use. If you know you're going to make a film, it's going to impact your research because you will want to have visual sources, you may want to have interviews. So the communication also has an impact on the research. And that's something we should think about. But public history is not only vulgarisation or divulgation, it's more than that. I don't really like that term because I think it's too limiting in our definition of public history. Chiara, yes, if I understand you correctly, yes, sources, research is important. And, if we talk about public historians, I don't really use the term public historians, I don't really like it. But if we talk about historians who do public history, they do research too. My students, when they do an exhibition, they do research and they have a methodology. So it's very important to say that public history is, again, not only communication, it has some research part. Marcello, your point about communication and also something you mentioned about the civic role of historians. It's something we've been talking with Enrica when she had a presentation about public history in Italy. We talk about the third mission, but what's the role of universities as well? It's not only communication, it's not only training. There is more discussion about the third mission of university, something very widespread in Anglo-Saxon universities who want to have this outreach and engagement. And I think when we do public history in universities, the topic is also about what's the link between university and communities, groups, people around us. What's the job of the university? It's not only training, yes, it is training. It's not only research. It's also about helping local or regional community to do history and to make history. I think this concept of third mission, engagement, civic role, I wouldn't say leading, but helping and working with the co-production is more and more important and raises some questions about shared authority, but something that is very timely and something we need to talk about when we want to develop public history in universities. It's not only about training, it's not only about funding, it's also about what the role of universities will be in the next 10, 50 years or so. I believe I've tried to answer them all. Did I forget some questions, or are there new questions, Marcello?
No, hai risposto a tutti, non hai dimenticato nulla. E a questo punto, diciamo, siamo arrivati esattamente alle 2 ore previste di seminario, e ringraziando te, ringraziando tutti i partecipanti, tutti gli amici che hanno voluto anche farti domande e fare osservazioni su questo bel seminario. Ricevo già qualche richiesta di poter avere, se possibile, le tue slide per poter fare qualche lezione anche sulla base di questa bella, diciamo, seminario che tu ci hai lasciato oggi, e sperando di vederci tutti molto presto, fighting the Covid, diciamo, ci salutiamo e ci vediamo con alcuni di voi lunedì ad un nuovo appuntamento dell'Associazione Italiana di Public History. Un abbraccio, grazie.
Thank you,
Grazie.
thank you all. Yes, I will send you my slides, and I will see some of you tomorrow for the Festival of International Public History.
Certo, domani infatti tu sarai in collegamento virtuale con gli amici del Salento al convegno internazionale di Public History. Tu e Sergio Marè, lo ricordiamo, qui c'è stata anche la Giuliana Iurlano con noi, e un abbraccio a tutti e grazie ancora, Tomà, del tuo tempo e della tua bella lezione.
Thank you, Marcello.
Grazie, ciao.
Ciao, grazie.
Grazie, arrivederci.